Well, let's take a break from the new patches for a second. Let's take a break from talking about Cantha for a second. The devs did announce with the slurry of news the other day that the next main Icebrood Saga episode would be taking us here to the Woodland Cascades, which is actually a fairly interesting region of the world we've seen basically nothing of in Guild Wars 2 so far. So I thought I'd talk to you guys about it, what we might expect, and particularly do a bit of a retrospective and look at how this area was in Guild Wars 1, where we could visit a thin, narrow slice. That's going to be the majority of the video, but let's open by talking about it in Guild Wars 2 at the very least. And, well, that's a short story. We've never really been here, except during Heart of Thorns, when they introduced the Bastion of the Penitent raid. The last Heart of Thorns raid, I think it was, or did maybe Wing 5 and Doom and the Underworld come out at the same time? But for that reason, this is technically, as far as the game engine is concerned, considered a part of the Maguma jungle. I'm sure that would change. And the truth is that the Bastion itself, even though it's located here, we enter it via portals, so there's no real travel around, and most of it is in this narrow cavern that quickly then goes underground, and you really don't get to see much of what's going on in the region itself. We do this little bit of story here with Glenna, we move on, and we start dealing a lot with the Massar and the Saul story. You guys can check out my video covering all the story of that if you'd like. It's probably one of the highlights of the entire game for me. So it's a great story, but really had nothing to do with the region whatsoever, unless you maybe consider that the Massar had this cool jail here, and it's near what the devs have listed as Janthir Bay. Janthir Bay is not a place we went to in Guild Wars 1 or 2. The Isles of Janthir are not a place we went to in Guild Wars 1 or 2. This is all just a complete mystery, basically. But feels, because of this word Janthir, and because of the Bastion now being close to it, feels like it's kind of Massar related, and therefore maybe they were in the Woodland Cascades too. If you're familiar with the story of Saul D'Alessio before this wing came out, and his drunken stumbling in exile away from Kryta, he found a great city in the forest. Maybe it was the Woodland Cascades that he found that city, and that would maybe be even more reason to expect Massart stuff. But all of that said, I really don't know whether the Icebrood Saga will deal with that, even though we're coming to this region of the world. First of all, I expect us to be more on the right than on the left, and I'm actually quite doubtful that we'll be able to return to this general area, right? Like, maybe we'll border on it, but the idea of actually being able to see what's on top of that cliff, say, just because of the way that the parchment art and stuff works, I just can't imagine. But also, Icebrood Saga is not about the Massart anymore. I feel like Guild Wars 2 had its Massart day. You know, we did like another civil war in Kryta. A lot of Season 3 dealt with that. And even we had the extra episode, if you will, right before Path of Fire at Siren's Landing that really kind of felt like it finished those things. So, I don't know. And there's so many other stories on the table right now to do with Jormag, to do with potentially the Deep Sea Dragon, that where's the room for it? Why would it be appropriate? Unless maybe we end up doing something in the waters out here and then we actually learn a bit more about Janthir. I mean, I'd enjoy it as a lore geek, I would, and I would have reasonable faith that the devs could do a good job. I just don't know whether it's time. Maybe this would be something for something that's not even Guild Wars 2, if ever. It's a weird thought. Anyway, back to the Woodland Cascades. That's it for Guild Wars 1. There's really not much else going on. I would expect us to enter somewhere from this region, considering, you know, the new story. The character I'm playing right now hasn't actually been there, but I'd expect us to maybe come from here. There's a chance that maybe we get a northern exit from Harathi. That would be pretty goddamn badass, particularly considering some lore I'm going to give you from Guild Wars 1 in a second, but that's about it. So now I'm going to shove you over to some Guild Wars 1 footage for the rest of the video. This is me right here in 2020, about an hour ago, playing through a map called the Verdant Cascades, which was a part of the Guild Wars 1 Eye of the North expansion. And so in the Icebrood Saga so far, you will of course have seen that we're going to a lot of Guild Wars 1 Eye of the North locations. The Char Homelands, the Far Shiver Peaks, and now even here too. This has always been a bit of an odd map as far as Eye of the North expansion was concerned, because I've always felt like it was a bit pointless. Now don't get me wrong, I liked visiting this area, but it was a very, very, very small little section. As far as the full landmass is concerned, even though we got a full explorable map in Guild Wars 1 here, that really didn't cover too much territory. So I've always kind of wondered, why did the devs push so hard to get this green verdant area into the expansion? Basically, you only travel through here in order to find a cave, which has an Asura gate that takes you to the Tarnished Coast, south of the Maguma jungle, where Sylvari and Asura characters start 250 years later in Guild Wars 2, so that you can meet the Asura. there's really no necessity to come here. Why didn't the devs just implement it that the Asura Gate, taking you to the Tarnished Coast, was found right there in the far Shiver Peaks, nearer to the Eye of the North or any great Norn settlement up there? Then you wouldn't need to implement this. But the devs did try. I wonder whether that's because initially this was scheduled to be a bigger part of the expansion, then get culled away. But there was a general thing that Eye of the North was doing that I really want you guys to pay attention to, and that's it established so much on the world map that it never did anything with. Just like the Verdant Cascades here, where we get a tiny little slice, the whole idea of that delta and what eventually became known as the Janthir Bay and these mysterious island chain that looks like the Fire Island chain to the north, all that stuff all got introduced in Eye of the North, and they did nothing with it in Eye of the North. There can only be one reason why. It's because they wanted to do stuff with it in the sequel. Well, here we are in the sequel. It's actually been over 7 years. And only now, as of this next patch, are we reaching that point. Now, on the next release, will we finally get to see the Guild Wars 2 game play with this stuff Eye of the North teased us about, which I really like. And of course, in Guild Wars 2, I'm sure that our exploration will overlap a bit with the Guild Wars 1 areas you're watching me run through right now. But also, Guild Wars 2 maps tend to be much, much, much bigger than Guild Wars 1 maps, so we'll be able to go into new territories for this region for the first time in the entire history of the MMO, of the franchise, which is one reason I'm really, really excited about this. It kind of feels like we're now pushing new grounds. The start of Icebrood Saga was mostly content to just give us Guild Wars 1 locations. You know, we went to the Char Homelands, but mostly just where we were in Guild Wars 1. We went to the Far Shiver Peaks, but mostly just where we were in Guild Wars 1. And now we're kind of forging new territories with probably a little bit of overlap. So let's talk about the stuff that you're seeing here. You've probably already seen me race the Norn. That was one of the small side quests here. There wasn't much happening because it was mostly a map you went through on your way elsewhere. Either on your first exploration through Eye of the North as you were heading to the Asura, as I've mentioned, or actually after the game was beaten, a new dungeon unlocked after the defeat of the Great Destroyer, which was kind of like the end game dungeon for Eye of the North, where you were dealing with the stone summits that sought to take control of this new power vacuum and was probably one of the most ran farm dungeons. So you'd kind of run through this map on your way there, but you weren't doing anything in particular there. Another little bit about the lore and background of this area that Guild Wars 1 opens up actually isn't got nothing to do with Eye of the North, but Prophecies, the very original release of the game, where in Crita you could find this optional outpost, Beetleton. Some of you Guild Wars 2 players may recognize the idea of Beetleton. It does exist in Guild Wars 2. It's where Lord Codicus was. You've obviously got the dungeon there now. In Guild Wars 1, it was a small outpost, and you could read the outpost description, which said this. And remember, north of Beetleton is basically this region of the world that we'll be going to next patch. Beetleton said, historians speculate that in a time out of mind, these now ruined watchtowers at Beetleton guarded Crita from some unknown northern threat. Now, the crumbled towers stand like ancient stone soldiers, still awaiting the arrival of that mysterious enemy from across the great saltwater lake called the Giant's Basin. In Guild Wars 2, of course, we've seen that the Giant's Basin is somewhat... there kind of used to be 2 of them in Guild Wars 1. Now the Giant's Basin is like only 1, and it's actually way off on the other side of Divinity's Reach, not near Beetleton at all. You have the Eastern Divinity Dam kind of nearby, but when we got to go to Lake Doric in Season 3, you saw the state of that place and how it all got drained out and flooded. I actually wonder, since Season 3... if the dam's rebuilt, does that mean the lake's kind of coming back with the water level have risen again in Lake Doric? It's kind of interesting. But the idea is then that this region of the world, the Woodland Cascades, as they're called in Guild Wars 2, has some mysterious, interesting enemy from an ancient time that was going to attack the south. And Guild Wars 2 could totally go into that. When we explored it in Eye of the North, we didn't really see anything. There were the Jotun that came down from the nearby mountains. You can find some of them in the explorable map. I'm not actually sure any of the footage you're watching shows me fighting them. They're like tucked off in a hidden cave somewhere, if I remember rightly, and most people would only fight if they were vanquishing the area. And the Jotun obviously are a great and ancient powerful race, so maybe what was going on at Beetleton was referring to them. But I like the idea that it's something else. You'll remember that in the Bastion of the Penitent raid, which again is in this region of the world, we actually were introduced to an entirely new creature that had been imprisoned by the Massat. That was Samurog, What was the beast Samurog? Where did it come from, and why is it around? Well, maybe that's what the Beetleton outpost was referencing, and maybe some more hints and stories about what was going on with Samurog would be cool to get in this map. Hell, there's a lot of little hints and things in the raid from Guild Wars 2, like the idea of that forgotten prisoner, or the Jotun political prisoner that was in that jail. Maybe we could see the fallout of the raid and learn a little bit more about some of those hints the devs had established just a couple of years ago now. I tend to feel like the more recent the devs was like flirting with story material, the more likely it is to come back than ancient stuff from like 2005, 2006. So back to what we saw in Guild Wars 1, there were the Asura in this area. In Either North, there was a mechanic where at the race shrines you could speak to NPCs and they would give you buffs that would improve your reputation with them, or give you little bonuses as you killed creatures, and they tend to have different dialogue themed about different things. For the Asura, it was the idea that there was a crew in each map. One of my favorite crews in all of the lore is the idea of some Asura that had come to the surface and didn't like how high up the sky was, so they were trying to build machines that would bring the sky down and make everything cozy again, even though they were on the surface of Tyria. The crew in this particular map didn't like the smell on the surface, and they wanted to tweak that. Here's some dialogue from them. One of them says, "Gracious, you startled me. I was looking over the plans for a scent cleaning aromatic. We Asura have very sensitive noses. It's hard to work here with all the smells from these monsters. Why don't you give us a hand and get rid of them and their stench?" Another one says, "Have you heard? Our crew is making a scent cleaning aromatic to help with this horrible stench." What do you mean, what stench? Monsters, of course, and unwashed bookers. If you could kill a lot of these monsters, we could start to attune the components we already have. And finally, another little interesting tidbit is if you speak to them a second time, one of them says, "You'd never notice, but the Asura have an amazing sense of smell. We can navigate by our noses in the darkest caverns. We usually end up finding out where we're going or walking in circles until we've finished lunch." The idea of the Asura and their powerful noses, I don't have a single memory of ever being referenced or talked about in Guild Wars 2, but there it was, and this was the crew that you could interact with in this map. There are a couple of other little things. Nearby is the outpost of the Umbral Grotto. This is where you go underground and eventually find an Asura gate that takes you to the Tarnished Coast. The Umbral Grotto's description is that it was tucked between the dark granite of the mountain fastness. The Umbral Grotto is a lurking place for those who wish to keep their activity shrouded in shadow. The caverns beneath are overrun with stone summit dwarves from the southern Shiver Peaks, making the grotto a dangerous place to wander. And I have no doubt that we'll be able to go back to the grotto. It'll probably be some kind of waypoint in Guild Wars 2. I wouldn't be surprised of that at all. Another notable and probably one of my favorite things about this area is that this was the first appearance of the Quetzal variety of Tengu. Obviously, with the Canthan expansion announcement, a lot of us have been talking about the Tengu. I did a video just during this week talking about the idea that maybe they'll become a playable race and how plausible that is. You guys can check that out if you've missed it. But this was where we first found the green Quetzal. They've actually already reappeared in Guild Wars 2 during the Heart of Thorns expansion, but I would love to see that they still have some kind of outpost or presence here, even, you know, now in the sequel. It kind of feels like the environment of this place in Guild Wars 1 feels very jungly. Maybe the devs just didn't have too many assets to move around. In Guild Wars 2, I'd like to see the forest look different. I'd like to see it feel, you know, more piney, or the variety and density of trees and the foliage change. They already described that it's supposed to look a little bit like where the studio is based, right? Like the Northwest United States, I believe. So I would expect to change. And the idea of having parrot Tengu in that area might not fit anymore, so we may not see them. In Guild Wars 1, they were there, though. They had this little territory carved out in the south, and they would kill anyone who went in. Very reminiscent to me of the Tengu at Lion's Arch during the Attack of Scarlet, where they would just shoot down people to keep their isolation. The Quetzal were doing this. You could actually see that they'd murdered Asura and piled their bodies out at the borders of their territory. And they had a little sign that says, "These lands belong to the Quetzal. Trespassers will be killed and their bodies left at the edges of our land as a reminder to all others of what fate awaits them should they violate our boundaries." And you could go in there and you could kill them. You could also find them fighting nearby ambient mobs like Skelk, who patrolled the area a lot, and I wouldn't be surprised to see return in Guild Wars 2. Then, the last thing really that was going on in this area were the bosses. Now, the reason I mentioned the bosses is because if you take some of these other releases, say, last season when we went to the Jahai Bluffs, which overlapped with the Guild Wars 1 area, we actually saw that the devs took Guild Wars 1 bosses that had interesting drops and sometimes re-implemented them in Guild Wars 2. Like, the Eye of Argon is a super rare drop you can only find in Jahai based on something that was going on in Guild Wars 1. So let's look at the bosses that were in this map. I think there were only like 3. So there was Wildam Rathspew. That's a Wind Rider. You might have seen me fight him already on the footage. Basically, a ton of Wind Riders were on this map. And at one point, you can find loads of them lined up on a log crossing a rushing river. And amongst them is this Mesmer Wind Rider that I handily defeat because I'm using Hexbreaker and stuff. But basically, what this guy does is he spams Migraine on you. And he drops a unique Mesmer weapon called Wildam's Wand. And you might find that ArenaNet add that in the sequel. The thing is, this weapon didn't really have unique stats or skin or anything, so I'm not sure if it's unique enough to warrant a place in the sequel. Another one, there's a Skelk boss, K-Kit the Hide Mender. That was a monk with Withdraw Hexes elite that you could capture. And again, had a focus for monks, K-Kit's focus, which wasn't special in any way. The coolest boss probably was the Quetzal boss. Deep in their territory is Petraj the Evasive. You could capture glass arrows from him if you were a ranger, and he had a recurve bow, which kind of was unique in that you could find that skin with those stats only on a recurve bow here. There was basically a duplicate, but wasn't a recurve bow somewhere else. So I don't know, maybe they'll do those. There is a final 4th boss, but only a part of a quest. That was the Facet quest chain, which was obviously the big hinty quest chain dealing with the facets of the gods and the connection to dragons, which, you know, I've covered and talked about many times over the years. I plugged enough of my own videos, but there is one there already. I don't know whether the devs will necessarily reference that. They certainly haven't with the other areas of the expansion that we've returned to. So that's it, really, for the bosses. There's some other nice little things, like the bees in the river. There's a bunch of moa birds, like in a flock, that you can find and stumble onto near the Umbral Grotto. They might do a reference to that racing Norn. Maybe there could be a roller beetle race or something on this map. I think that'd be pretty fun. But we're getting further and further away from the patch that added the roller beetles, so I wonder if the devs are getting a bit cagey about adding content that explicitly references that when players increasingly might not own it. Yeah, a bunch of crocodiles you could find. There's a rock slide in one area. Guild Wars 2 doesn't really do that kind of stuff, right? Like the environmental hazards. That was something the North did a lot, like rolling boulders and stuff. But in the persistent world of Guild Wars 2, the devs don't really touch too much. And yeah, I think that's it really, guys. So that's it. That's the Verdant Cascades. This is where we're going next patch. It represents something really cool. The first time Guild Wars 2 has started to explore new territories that were introduced on the Eye of the North expansion map so many years ago, specifically for the sequel. And now the sequel has found the space to actually explore them. Should be cool. I'd love to see any kind of Bastion references, any of these other old goodies and things I recognize from Guild Wars 1, like the dungeon entrances or the Umbral Grotto would be very cool. And we'll see what they do with the Quetzal. Mostly I'm interested in how they've modeled it and how the environments feel, because I do expect it might be a little bit different nowadays. There you have it, guys. That'll be the next patch. Thanks very much for watching. Let me know if you feel I missed anything or you want to just generally geek out in the comments. And if you haven't checked it out already, I've got a really cool Stellaris series going on that is probably more Guild Wars 2 related than you might expect. Cheers. I'll see you next time.